In downtown Atlanta, a rookie cop is about to make the biggest mistake of his career. When Officer Crawford spots an elderly black man in a luxury car, he sees what he wants to see: someone who doesn't belong. What he doesn't see is Marcus Washington, a former Navy SEAL with 27 years of classified operations under his belt. Known as the Gatekeeper in circles where respect is earned in blood, Washington is about to teach this overzealous officer that some old warriors never lose their power, to fight injustice, even when wearing handcuffs. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun barely peeked through the curtains of Marcus Washington's East Atlanta home when his eyes snapped open at exactly 5 a.m. 27 years of military service had permanently encoded that wake-up time into his DNA. At 62, his body still moved with the practiced precision of someone half his age as he made his bed with hospital corners sharp enough to bounce a quarter. In his walk-in closet, past the shadow box displaying his Navy Cross and other commendations, Marcus pulled out his Sunday best, a perfectly pressed charcoal grey suit. His daughter Sarah always teased him about being too proper for Sunday service, but some habits die hard. Proper had kept him alive in places whose names never made it onto any official maps. As he adjusted his tie in the mirror, his phone buzzed. Sarah's face appeared on the screen, her smile bright, but her eyes carrying that worry he'd grown too familiar with lately. "Morning, Daddy. Just checking in before church. You know me, baby girl. Same routine. Different Sunday." His deep voice carried the warmth it always had for her, but they both knew why she was really calling. "Did you see the news about what happened in Memphis?" Sarah's voice tightened. "Another traffic stop gone wrong. I worry, Daddy. Even with all your experience these days." Marcus watched his reflection as he straightened his already straight tie. The face, looking back at him, had aged well. Distinguished, his late wife used to say, but it was still the face that had made store security follow him, that had made women clutch their purses tighter, that had made rookie cops nervous even when he was in uniform. "Sarah, we've talked about this. I've handled worse situations in worse places. Trust your old man." "I know, Daddy. You're the toughest man I know. Just be careful, okay? These aren't the same battles you fought overseas." Marcus's eyes drifted to the photo on his dresser, him in full SEAL gear with his team in an undisclosed location, all of them alive and whole in that moment. "Maybe not, baby girl, but the principles remain the same. Maintain control, stay calm, use your training." After saying goodbye, Marcus headed to his garage. There she sat, gleaming in the early morning light, his pride and joy, a restored 1967 Ford Mustang GT 500, midnight blue with perfect chrome work. His wife had called him crazy for spending his retirement bonus on it, but she'd understood. After a lifetime of service, a man deserved something that was purely for the joy of it. The engine purred to life, the sound bringing a smile to his face as it did every Sunday. He eased out of his driveway, nodding to Mr. Chen next door, who was already out watering his prized roses. The neighborhood was changing, gentrifying, Sarah called it, but there was still a strong sense of community among the old-timers who'd been here through the tough years. Marcus drove with military precision, one hand resting easy on the wheel. In his rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of a patrol car pulling out onto the street behind him. His expression didn't change, but something deep in his gut, the same. Instinct that had kept him alive in countless operations told him this Sunday was about to be different. Officer James Crawford slouched in his chair during the morning briefing, barely concealing his disdain as Sergeant Martinez droned on about community engagement and de-escalation protocols. At 26, Crawford was already certain he knew better than these outdated approaches to policing. His right thumb unconsciously traced the outline of his badge as he half listened to yet another lecture about building trust in the wake of recent incidents. "Crawford," Martinez's sharp voice cut through his thoughts. "Since you seem so engaged this morning, perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on the new community outreach initiative." Crawford straightened in his chair, flashing the confident smile that had gotten him through the academy. "Yes, sir. I think we need to focus more on active policing rather than PR campaigns. Crime doesn't stop because we're hosting coffee meetings." A few of the older officers exchanged glances. Martinez's jaw tightened. "That's exactly the kind of attitude that's created the current climate, Officer Crawford. We're here to protect and serve, not occupy." "With all due respect, sir," Crawford couldn't help himself, "maybe if we worried less about hurting feelings and more about enforcing the law, we wouldn't have these problems in the first place." After the briefing, Crawford stood by his patrol car, checking his gear with aggressive precision. His partner, Officer Chen, was out sick, which suited him fine. Solo patrol meant no one to question his methods or report back to Martinez about his aggressive tactics. Crawford, a voice behind him, made him turn. Officer Watson, a 20-year veteran, approached with that look of concern Crawford had grown to hate. "Look, kid, I know you think you've got it all figured out, but you need to dial it back. Your arrest numbers are raising eyebrows, and not in a good way." Crawford felt his face flush. "My numbers are high because I'm doing my job. While everyone else is worried about social media backlash, I'm actually cleaning up these streets." Watson shook his head. "You're going to learn the hard way if you don't check that attitude. This job isn't about numbers or proving something. It's about save the lecture." Crawford cut him off, opening his car door. "I've got a sector to patrol." As he pulled out of the station parking lot, Crawford's jaw clenched. They didn't understand. In his mind, he wasn't the problem. He was the solution. The department had gone soft, too worried about public opinion and social justice warriors. His father, a former officer himself, had always told him that respect came from strength, not weakness. Crawford turned onto his patrol route, eyes scanning the streets with predatory focus. His sector included some of the rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods of East Atlanta. The mix of wealthy newcomers and longtime residents created what he saw as perfect opportunities for proactive policing. The morning sun glinted off his windshield as he spotted something that made him sit up straighter, a vintage Mustang, clearly expensive, with an elderly black man behind the wheel. Crawford's pulse quickened as he pulled out to follow. In his experience, things that didn't look right usually weren't. And this, he decided, definitely didn't look right for this neighborhood. A small voice in the back of his mind, one that sounded suspiciously like Sergeant Martinez, whispered about profiling and assumptions. Crawford pushed it aside. He hadn't made detective in record time by listening to those kinds of doubts. He was about to show everyone exactly why his methods got results. Marcus noticed the patrol car 3 blocks before Crawford made his move. In his side mirror, he watched the young officer's behavior, the way he tailgated slightly, how he ran the plates, the predatory positioning of his vehicle. 2 decades of combat experience had taught Marcus to read intent in the smallest details, and this officer's intent was clear as day. The streets of East Atlanta rolled by, a patchwork of old and new. Artisan coffee shops stood next to decades-old barbershops, craft breweries beside soul food restaurants. Marcus had watched this transformation from his front porch, seen the slow displacement of families who'd lived here for generations. Now, he watched another kind of displacement unfold in his rearview mirror. The cruiser's lights flashed. Marcus already had his license and registration in hand before pulling over, movements deliberate and calm. In his head, Sarah's voice echoed with concern, but deeper still lay the muscle memory of countless operations where calm meant survival. Crawford approached with his hand resting on his holster, a stance Marcus recognized as manufactured authority. A young man trying to project power he hadn't earned. "License and registration," Crawford barked, his tone carrying that edge Marcus had heard too many times before. "Good morning, officer," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd commanded elite teams in combat zones. He held out his documents with his left hand, keeping his right visible on the steering wheel. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" Crawford's eyes narrowed at the measured response, not matching the scenario he'd constructed in his mind. "You were driving erratically." The lie came easily to his lips. "This is a nice car for this neighborhood. Mind telling me where you got it?" Through the rolled-down window, Marcus could smell the coffee on Crawford's breath, see the slight tremor of adrenaline in his trigger finger. "I bought it with my retirement bonus, officer. I've lived in this neighborhood for 30 years. A small crowd had begun to gather on the sidewalk. Crawford noticed them too, his posture stiffening. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, taking a step back. Marcus recognized the escalation for what it was, fear masked as dominance. He'd seen it in young soldiers, in insurgents, in anyone who felt their authority challenged. "Officer," he said calmly, "I don't believe that's necessary. I've provided my documentation, and I've done nothing wrong." I said, "Step out of the vehicle." Crawford's voice rose, drawing more attention from passers-by. Some had their phones out now, recording. "Don't make this difficult, old man." As Marcus carefully opened his door, he noted every detail: the gathered crowd, the recording phones, Crawford's aggressive stance, the arrival of a second patrol car. In combat, situational awareness meant the difference between life and death. Here, on this Sunday morning street, it might mean the same thing. Standing at his full height, Marcus stood several inches taller than Crawford. His suit, worth more than 3 months of Crawford's salary, marked him as someone who didn't fit the officer's preconceptions. "Sir," Crawford said, his voice tight with confusion and growing anger, "turn around and place your hands on the vehicle." Marcus complied, his movements precise and controlled. As Crawford roughly patted him down, Marcus caught the eye of the gathering crowd. He saw the rage in their faces, the all-too-familiar scene playing out before them. But what they couldn't see was the tactical assessment running through Marcus's mind, the countless ways he could have disarmed and disabled this young officer before the second cruiser had even arrived. Instead, he stood motionless, letting Crawford's insecurity play out its predictable course. Because sometimes, Marcus knew, the most powerful weapon wasn't violence or resistance. It was letting someone else's mistakes become their own undoing. The second patrol car's arrival brought Officer Rodriguez, a mid-career cop who recognized the shifting dynamics of the scene immediately. The growing crowd, the phones recording, the clear disconnect between Crawford's aggressive stance and the well-dressed elderly man's calm demeanor. It all spelled trouble. "What seems to be the problem here?" Rodriguez approached, his voice deliberately neutral. His eyes caught the military bearing in Marcus's stance, the quiet dignity that spoke of something deeper than mere compliance. Crawford jumped in before Marcus could respond. Subject was driving suspiciously, refused to comply with initial commands. "I'm conducting a vehicle search." His words came fast, defensive, each one digging the hole deeper. Marcus remained silent, his hands still placed on his car's roof. His mind flashed to a mission in Kandahar, where patience and restraint had saved his entire team. The same principles applied here. Let the aggressor reveal their weakness. "Sir," Rodriguez addressed Marcus, "could you provide your ID again?" He was trying to de-escalate, but Crawford stepped forward, cutting him off. "I've got this, Rodriguez. Don't need backup for a routine stop." Crawford's voice carried that dangerous edge of authority challenged. He turned back to Marcus. "Pop the trunk." "Officer," Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of command without aggression, "I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. I've provided my identification, and I have broken no laws." The crowd had grown larger. Whispers rippled through it, phones recording every moment. Crawford felt the pressure of those eyes, those cameras, and it pushed him exactly where Marcus knew it would, toward escalation. "Listen here." Crawford grabbed Marcus's arm roughly, spinning him around. "You don't get to tell me what—" The movement was a mistake. Marcus's combat-trained reflexes nearly kicked in. Muscle memory from years of close-quarter combat, suggesting a dozen ways to neutralize the threat. But he controlled the impulse, letting Crawford complete the aggressive move. Rodriguez stepped forward again, recognizing the situation spiraling. "Crawford, maybe we should—" "He's resisting," Crawford shouted, though Marcus hadn't moved a muscle. The young officer pulled his handcuffs out, his movements jerky with adrenaline. "On your knees now." Phones recorded as Crawford forced Marcus down onto the rough asphalt, the elderly man's expensive suit collecting road dust. The crowd's angry murmurs grew louder, but Marcus remained eerily calm. He knew what was coming next, had planned for it from the moment those lights had appeared in his mirror. As the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, Marcus looked directly into one of the recording phones. His voice, when it came, carried clearly across the now silent street. "I want to speak with Internal Affairs, and someone please contact Colonel Richards at the Pentagon. He'll want to know a Navy SEAL is being arrested for driving his own car to church." The effect was immediate. Rodriguez's face went pale. Even Crawford's aggressive movements faltered as the implications of Marcus's words sank in. But it was too late. The damage was done. The scene recorded. The wheels of justice already beginning to turn in an unexpected direction. Crawford's world narrowed to a tunnel of stubbornness and pride as the implications of Marcus's words registered. Instead of backing down, he tightened his grip, roughly pulling Marcus to his feet. The Navy SEAL allowed himself to be manhandled, each excessive use of force another nail in Crawford's professional coffin. "Watch your head," Crawford growled, though he made no real effort to protect Marcus as he shoved him into the back of the patrol car. The crowd's phones captured every moment, every unnecessary push, every abuse of power. A young woman in the crowd shouted, "I'm calling Sarah Washington! That's her father!" The name meant nothing to Crawford, but Rodriguez flinched. Sarah Washington was a prominent civil rights attorney who'd already won 3 major cases against the department. Marcus sat in the back of the patrol car with perfect posture, his military bearing unchanged by the handcuffs or the indignity of his arrest. Through the window, he could see people in the crowd making calls, their faces a mix of outrage and purpose. This wasn't his first time being trapped in a small space under hostile conditions. Like those other times, patience would be his ally. "Crawford," Rodriguez hissed, grabbing his fellow officer's arm, "do you have any idea what you've done? This man is under arrest for resisting and suspicious behavior." Crawford cut him off, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. The crowd had swelled to nearly 50 people now, their phones like weapons pointed at him. A deep voice cut through the tension. "Marcus?" An elderly man in a deacon's collar pushed through the crowd. "Marcus Washington. Dear Lord, what's happening?" "Here. Hello, Deacon Jones," Marcus called calmly through the car window. "Seems I'll be missing service today. Please tell the congregation not to worry." The deacon's face hardened as he turned to the officers. "Do you have any idea who this man is, what he's done for this country?" Crawford's radio crackled to life before he could respond. "All units involved in the Washington arrest, report to station immediately. Captain Myers wants everyone in his office. Now." The crowd parted as Crawford's patrol car pulled away from the curb, their phones still recording. In the back seat, Marcus watched his neighborhood recede through the window. He'd been in worse situations, in worse places. But somehow, this one felt more important than any mission he'd undertaken in his decades of service. Behind them, the crowd was already mobilizing. Phones shared the video across social media platforms, calls were made to newsrooms and law offices, and the machinery of justice, both legal and social, began to grind into motion. Rodriguez followed in his patrol car, already composing in his head what he would tell Internal Affairs. In his 20 years on the force, he'd never seen a routine traffic stop go so wrong, so fast, and he'd never seen someone handle wrongful arrest with such tactical precision, almost as if the elderly man in the back of Crawford's patrol car had been waiting for this moment, prepared for it, ready to turn it into something bigger than just another case of police misconduct. As they drove toward the station, Crawford's hands were tight on the steering wheel, his jaw clenched. In the rear-view mirror, he caught a glimpse of his prisoner's face, calm, collected, almost peaceful. It sent a chill down his spine. Somehow, in the space of 15 minutes, he'd gone from confident young officer to a man driving himself toward his own professional destruction, and his prisoner knew it. The fluorescent lights of the booking area cast harsh shadows as Crawford led Marcus through the station's processing procedures. The normal Sunday morning quiet had been shattered. Officers whispered in corners, desk sergeants made hurried phone calls, and an unusual tension filled the air. "Name?" the booking officer asked mechanically, before looking up from his computer. His eyes widened as he recognized Marcus. "Wait, Master Chief Washington?" Marcus nodded politely, still handcuffed. "Hello, Jimmy. How's your mother doing? Did that VA paperwork go through?" The booking officer, Jimmy Chen, stood up straight, his face paling. 2 years ago, Marcus had helped his mother navigate a complex veterans benefits claim. "Sir, what are you doing here?" Before Marcus could answer, Captain Myers burst through the door, his face a storm cloud of barely contained fury. "Get those cuffs off him! Now!" His voice boomed through the booking area. Crawford fumbled with the keys as Myers turned to Marcus. "Master Chief Washington, I cannot begin to express—" "Captain," Marcus interrupted smoothly, rubbing his wrists. "As the cuffs came off, I believe we should handle this properly. I'd like to file a formal complaint, and I want every second of footage from Officer Crawford's body cam and dash cam preserved." Myers knew that tone. It was the voice of a man who had commanded elite teams in combat zones, who had testified before Congress, who had trained hundreds of soldiers. This wasn't going to be a simple apology and make-it-go-away situation. "Of course, sir. My office, please." Myers shot Crawford a look that promised future consequences. "Officer Crawford, stay right here. Internal Affairs is already on their way." As they walked through the station, officers stopped and stared. Many recognized Marcus. He'd been a regular at community meetings, had helped with the department's veteran outreach programs, had even taught a few training sessions on crisis management. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. In Myers' office, Marcus declined the offered seat. "Captain, what happened today is just a symptom. Your department has a systemic problem, and Officer Crawford is just the most recent manifestation." Myers sank into his chair, suddenly looking much older. "Master Chief, I know we have issues we're working on, but—" "No buts, Captain." Marcus's voice was steel wrapped in velvet. "I've spent decades reading situations and people. Today didn't happen because one officer made a bad call. It happened because your department's culture allowed him to think he could make that call." A knock at the door interrupted them. A young officer poked her head in, her face ashen. "Captain, sir, the video is already online. It's gone viral. CNN is calling and, sir, the Pentagon has online one." Myers reached for his phone, but Marcus held up a hand. "Before you take that call, Captain, let me be clear about what happens next. This isn't going away with an apology and a suspension. I'm going to use this incident to force real change. Not just here, but in departments across the country." The phone kept ringing as Myers stared at Marcus, recognizing the same determination that had made him a legendary SEAL commander. "What exactly are you planning, Master Chief?" "I'm planning to do what I've always done, Captain. Take a bad situation and turn it into a training opportunity." Marcus straightened his tie, still impeccable despite the morning's events. "The question is, will your department be an example of what went wrong, or an example of how to make it right?" In the booking area, Crawford sat alone, watching his career crumble through the rapidly spreading social media storm on his phone. The video had already been shared thousands of times, with comment sections filled with outrage and calls for his badge. But what terrified him most wasn't the public reaction. It was the calm, calculated look in Marcus Washington's eyes as he'd been led away in handcuffs. It was the look of a man who had been in far worse situations and had emerged, victorious every time. Sarah Washington was in the middle of Sunday brunch when her phone exploded with notifications. The video of her father's arrest filled her screen, and years of legal training couldn't prevent her hands from shaking with rage. Within minutes, she had activated a response that would shake the department to its foundations. "Get me Judge Thompson," she barked into her phone while sending rapid-fire texts. "And connect me to David at the Times. This isn't just another incident. This is my father." Her legal assistant's voice came back immediately. "Already on it. CNN is calling, and Colonel Richards is trying to reach you." Across town, in a private golf club where retired military officers spent their Sundays, phones began buzzing simultaneously. Colonel Jack Richards, Marcus's former commanding officer, stepped away from the ninth hole as the video played on his phone. His face darkened with each passing second. "Get me SecNav on the line," he growled to his assistant, "and contact the rest of the team. All of them." Around him, other retired officers were already making calls, a network of powerful connections spinning into action. Back at the station, Crawford sat in an interview room, unaware of the machinery moving against him. His union representative, Dave Miller, looked increasingly uncomfortable as he watched. The viral video for the first time. "Jesus, kid," Miller ran a hand over his face. "Of all the people to profile, do you have any idea who Marcus Washington is, the connections he has?" Crawford's defiance was beginning to crack. "How was I supposed to know? He was just some old guy in a fancy car." "Some old guy?" Miller laughed bitterly. "That old guy has a Navy Cross. He's testified before Congress on military training reforms. Half the brass in the Pentagon knows him personally, and his daughter is one of the top civil rights attorneys in the country." In Marcus's home office, his old SEAL team was assembling via a hastily arranged video conference. 6 faces filled the screen, each bearing the weathered look of men who had seen the worst the world had to offer. "Did you see the video?" Commander Mike "Ghost" Peterson's voice crackled through the speakers. "Our Master Chief, handled like some common criminal." "I've got 3 news channels asking for comments," added Chief Tom Razor Rodriguez. "And social media is on fire. What's the play here, boys?" The youngest of the group, James "Doc" Wilson, now a prominent psychiatrist specializing in police psychology, leaned forward. "This could be the case we've been waiting for. Master Chief always said we needed the right moment to push for police reform. This is it." Across the city, state, and nation, more phones rang. More videos were shared, more connections were made. Sarah Washington's office became a command center, coordinating legal strategies with civil rights organizations, fielding media requests, and building a case that would go far beyond one wrongful arrest. In her office, surrounded by ringing phones and urgent emails, Sarah paused to take a deep breath. She knew her father would handle this situation with the same tactical precision he'd applied to military operations. This wasn't just about one incident or one officer. This was about systemic change, and Marcus Washington had just become its catalyst. Her phone buzzed again, a message from her father. "Everything proceeding according to plan. Remember what I taught you about strategic patience?" Sarah smiled grimly. Crawford and his department had no idea what was coming. They'd picked the wrong man to profile, the wrong family to harass, and the wrong moment in history to make this mistake. As she turned back to her work, Sarah knew that by the end of this, police departments across the country would be studying this case, not just as an example of what went wrong, but as a blueprint for the changes that needed to come. By early afternoon, the steps of Atlanta Police Department headquarters had become a sea of protesters. Deacon Jones stood at the center, his church collar gleaming in the sunlight, leading a crowd that grew larger by the minute. News vans lined the street, their satellite dishes reaching toward the sky like metal trees. "This isn't just about Master Chief Washington," the deacon's voice boomed through a megaphone. "This is about every black man who's been profiled, every veteran who's been disrespected, every citizen who's had their rights violated." Inside the building, Captain Myers watched the gathering crowd from his window while juggling calls from the mayor's office, the police commissioner, and various media outlets. On his desk, his computer showed the viral video's view count climbing past 1 million. The comments section was a battleground of public outrage and defensive Blue Line supporters. "Sir," his assistant interrupted, "the Pentagon's public affairs office is issuing a statement. They're highlighting Master Chief Washington's service record." Myers clicked the link she sent. His heart sank as he read, "Master Chief Marcus Washington, Retta, served with distinction for 27 years as a Navy SEAL, earning the Navy Cross for actions that remain classified. His contributions to military training protocols have saved countless lives, and his commitment to public service extends well beyond his military career." Across town, at the local CBS affiliate, reporter Maria Chen prepared for her live broadcast. "We're getting reports that Master Chief Washington's arrest has triggered internal investigations in multiple police departments," she spoke into the camera. "Departments across the country are now reviewing their training protocols and profiling statistics." Her producer's voice crackled in her earpiece. "Breaking news! We've got confirmation that 3 senior officers from neighboring departments have resigned over similar profiling incidents in the past month. This is spreading fast." Social media amplified the story with every passing hour. Justice for Master Chief trended nationwide. Veterans groups posted photos of Marcus from his service days, standing with generals and politicians. Civil rights organizations shared statistics about police profiling, using the incident as a rallying cry for reform. At the local diner where police officers usually gathered for lunch, the usual crowd was notably absent. Officer Rodriguez sat alone at the counter, picking at his food while the TV above the bar played continuous coverage of the incident. "Can't believe that's the same guy who taught our crisis management seminar last year," the diner's owner May said as she refilled his coffee. "Always so respectful, always had time to listen to everyone. And this is how they treat him?" Rodriguez pushed his plate away. "You know what the worst part is, May? He knew exactly what he was doing, the way he handled it, the calm in his voice. He turned Crawford's mistake into a masterclass on exposing systemic problems." Outside the diner's window, more protesters marched past, carrying signs with Marcus's military photo and slogans demanding justice. But unlike many protests, this one had a unique composition. Veterans in their service caps walked alongside community activists, retired police officers, marched next to civil rights leaders. Sarah Washington's phone rang again. This time, it was the governor's office. "Yes, sir," she spoke clearly into the phone. "My father is willing to meet, but he has conditions. This isn't about one incident or one department anymore. This is about fundamental change." As the sun began to set, the protest crowds showed no signs of dispersing. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing the scene for the evening broadcasts. Inside the station, Crawford sat alone in the break room, watching his face appear on every channel, his actions dissected by panels of experts who used terms like systemic bias and institutional reform. On his phone, he pulled up Marcus Washington's service record, now being widely shared online. The list of accomplishments, the classified missions, the commendations, it read like a Hollywood script. But it was the last line that hit him hardest. "Currently serves as a civilian consultant on police community relations, specializing in de-escalation techniques and bias recognition." Crawford finally understood. He hadn't just arrested the wrong man, he'd given a tactical expert in police reform the perfect case study for everything wrong with modern policing. And Marcus Washington had played it perfectly, turning one officer's bias into a national wake-up call. The police station's conference room had been transformed into an impromptu war room by late afternoon. Marcus sat at the head of the table, his posture relaxed but commanding, while department officials fidgeted nervously in their seats. His suit jacket was draped precisely over his chair, his tie still perfectly straight despite the day's events. "Let me be clear." Marcus's voice carried the same calm authority he'd used to brief admirals. "I'm declining your offer of immediate release and a public apology. That's not going to be enough this time." Captain Myers shifted uncomfortably. "Master Chief, we're prepared to suspend Officer Crawford pending investigation." "That's not enough either," Marcus interrupted smoothly. "We both know suspension is just a temporary solution to a permanent problem. I've spent decades analyzing tactical situations, Captain. Want to know what I see here?" The room fell silent. Even the department's legal counsel leaned forward. "I see a department that's trained its officers to react instead of think, to dominate instead of serve, to escalate instead of communicate." Marcus placed his hands flat on the table. "But more importantly, I see an opportunity." Outside the conference room, Crawford sat with his union representative, watching through the glass as Marcus commanded the attention of every senior officer present. The young officer's arrogance had been replaced by a growing realization of just how thoroughly he'd been outmaneuvered. "Your client has 3 options," Sarah Washington explained to Crawford's union rep, her legal pad covered in precise notes. "He can fight this, lose, and become the face of everything wrong with modern policing. He can resign, fade away, and hope everyone forgets. Or," she paused meaningfully, "or what?" Crawford found himself asking, "or he can be part of the solution. My father believes even the worst situations can become teaching moments. The question is, are you willing to learn?" Back in the conference room, Marcus was laying out his terms. "I want a complete overhaul of your training programs, not just diversity training or de-escalation workshops. I'm talking about fundamental changes in how you select, train, and evaluate officers." "That's a tall order," the police commissioner interjected from the video screen on the wall. "Change like that takes time, resources." "You have both," Marcus cut in. "What you've lacked is motivation. Well, congratulations, you've got that now too." He gestured toward the windows, where protesters could still be seen gathering outside. "The question isn't whether change is coming. The question is whether you want to lead that change or be dragged along behind it." His phone buzzed. Another message from his old SEAL team. They'd secured commitments from 3 police academies to pilot new training programs. The pieces were falling into place. The department's PR director rushed in with fresh polling data. Public opinion had shifted dramatically in the past few hours, with overwhelming support for Marcus and calls for police reform. The hashtag had evolved from "Justice for Master Chief" to "Reform with Master Chief." "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus continued, his voice carrying the weight of inevitable victory. "Tomorrow, I'm not going to be on TV attacking your department. Instead, I'm going to announce a new police training initiative with your department as the pilot program. You're not going to be the villains of this story. You're going to be the example of how to fix a broken system." The commissioner's face on the screen showed dawning comprehension. This wasn't just damage control. This was a complete reframe of the narrative. Marcus wasn't just seeking justice. He was orchestrating transformation. "And Officer Crawford?" Captain Myers asked carefully. Marcus allowed himself a small smile. "If he's willing to learn, he's about to become a case study in how bias can be unlearned, how mistakes can lead to growth, and how even the worst moments can be turned into opportunities for change." The room fell silent as the implications sank. In Marcus Washington hadn't just turned his wrongful arrest into a movement, he'd turned it into a mission. And like every mission he'd led over his decades of service, failure wasn't an option. The Internal Affairs Office hummed with activity as investigators pored over Officer Crawford's body cam footage. The morning's incident played out on multiple screens, each viewing revealing new layers of problematic behavior. But it wasn't just Crawford under the microscope. His past arrests were being scrutinized with unprecedented attention. "Look at this pattern." Lieutenant Gloria Martinez from IA pointed to a spreadsheet displaying Crawford's arrest statistics. 87% of his discretionary stops involved minorities. That's nearly double the department average. Beside, her Marcus's daughter Sarah examined the data with a lawyer's practiced eye, and the body cam footage shows a clear escalation pattern. He creates confrontation, then uses the subject's response to justify aggressive action. The investigation had expanded beyond Crawford. Every officer who'd worked with him, every supervisor who'd signed off on his reports, every complaint that had been filed, all of it was being pulled into the light. "These performance reviews are interesting," Sarah noted, spreading documents across the conference table. Multiple supervisors noted his proactive policing style, but none addressed the clear racial disparity in his stops. Martinez rubbed her temples. "It's not just Crawford. Look at these departmental stats." She pulled up another file. "We've had a 40% increase in use of force incidents during traffic stops over the past 3 years. The warning signs were there, but nobody connected the dots." In another room, tech specialists were analyzing Crawford's dashcam footage from the past 6 months. The pattern was undeniable. Selective enforcement, escalated encounters, and a clear bias in who he chose to stop. "Sir," a young analyst called to Marcus, who stood observing the investigation, "we found something interesting in his social media history." The screen showed Crawford's private Facebook posts obtained through warrant. Years of subtle and not-so-subtle comments revealed a mindset that had been cultivated long before he joined the force. Marcus studied the evidence with the same tactical precision he'd once used to analyze enemy positions. "This isn't about one officer's bias," he observed. "This is about a system that attracts, reinforces, and protects these attitudes." The investigation expanded outward like ripples in a pond. Other officers' records were being reviewed, department policies scrutinized, training programs analyzed. What had started as an investigation into one incident was becoming an autopsy of an entire system. Body cam footage from Crawford's fellow officers revealed a culture of casual discrimination. Training materials showed outdated approaches to community interaction. Even the department's hiring practices came under scrutiny, revealing subtle biases in how candidates were selected and evaluated. "Your father's arrest might have been the catalyst," Martinez said to Sarah, "but this goes deeper than we imagined. The whole system needs an overhaul." Sarah nodded, making notes for what would become a comprehensive reform proposal. "That's exactly what my father expected. He didn't just want to expose one officer's misconduct. He wanted to expose the environment that made it possible." As evening approached, Crawford sat reviewing his own record with growing discomfort. Each incident report, each traffic stop, each confrontation, viewed through new eyes, he began to see what others had seen all along. The realization was both humbling and horrifying. "The hardest part of correcting a mistake," Marcus had told him earlier, "is admitting the mistake was there in the first place." The investigation was revealing more than just bias and misconduct. It was exposing the gaps between policy and practice, between training and reality, between the department's stated values and its daily operations. And in those gaps, the seeds of real change were beginning to take root. The police department's break room had become a battleground of whispered arguments and tense silences. Officers clustered in small groups, their divisions as clear as battle lines. The old guard stood defensive. Younger reformers pushed for change, and those caught in the middle tried to navigate the growing storm. "You're all acting like Crawford's the only one," Officer Chen argued, his voice carrying across the room. "How many of us have made assumptions, pushed a little too hard, let our biases affect our judgment? Don't lump us all in with him." Another officer shot back. "Some of us know how to do this job right." The tension wasn't limited to the rank and file. In offices throughout the building, sergeants and lieutenants found themselves defending years of decisions, explaining away warning, signs they'd ignored, justifying practices that suddenly looked indefensible under scrutiny. Marcus's SEAL network had begun applying pressure in unexpected places. Police equipment suppliers, training contractors, union representatives, everyone with a stake in law enforcement felt the squeeze. Phone calls from Pentagon connections carried weight. Suggestions from veteran-owned businesses couldn't be ignored. "They're threatening to pull our training contract," a sergeant reported to Captain Myers. "Said they won't be associated with departments that don't meet the new standards Master Chief Washington is proposing." Myers had his own problems. City council members were demanding answers. Community leaders wanted meetings. Even his own family was asking questions he couldn't comfortably answer. In the patrol room, Crawford sat alone, a pariah in the department he'd once thought would celebrate his aggressive style. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from officers in other departments, some supportive, many critical, all watching his downfall with intense interest. "Officer Crawford?" A voice made him look up. Rodriguez stood there, looking uncomfortable. "Master Chief Washington wants to see you." The walk to the conference room felt like a march to execution, but when Crawford entered, he found not just Marcus, but a group of officers from across the department, veterans, rookies, detectives, patrol officers. "Sit down, Officer Crawford," Marcus gestured to an empty chair. "These officers have something to share with you." One by one they spoke. Stories of mistakes made, lessons learned, biases recognized and overcome. Not excuses or defenses, but honest admissions of the challenges they'd faced in balancing authority with responsibility. "The job changes you," a veteran detective explained. "The question is whether it changes you for better or worse. That's a choice we make every day." Outside the station, the pressure continued to mount. Protesters had been joined by military veterans, their presence lending weight and legitimacy to the calls for reform. News crews captured the image of decorated veterans standing shoulder to shoulder with community activists. Sarah Washington's legal team had set up a hotline for other victims of profiling to share their stories. The flood of calls crashed their system within hours. Each new account added weight to their demands for systematic change. Marcus's former SEAL teammates had spread out across the country, speaking at police academies and department meetings, sharing their perspectives on leadership, discipline, and the responsible use of authority. The message was clear: change was coming, with or without cooperation. In his office, Captain Myers watched another department across the state announce comprehensive reforms, trying to get ahead of the wave. His phone rang, the commissioner calling again about Marcus's proposal. "We're not just talking about sensitivity training here," Myers explained, exhaustion in his voice. "He wants a complete overhaul. New screening procedures, revised use of force protocols, community oversight boards with real power. It's everything. We've been resisting for years, and if we resist now," the commissioner asked. Myers looked out his window at the growing crowd of protesters, at the veterans standing at attention in their dress uniforms, at the media trucks lining the street. "Then we become the example of what not to do," he answered. "Master Chief Washington isn't just fighting a battle here. He's running a campaign, and he's got us surrounded." Sarah Washington sat in her office late into the night, surrounded by stacks of police reports, her desk illuminated by the blue glow of her computer screen. What had started as an investigation into Crawford's conduct had unveiled something far more troubling. Patterns emerged from the data, like shadows taking shape in darkness. "Dad, you need to see this," she spoke into her phone, her voice tight with controlled anger. "It's not just Crawford. The department has been systematically burying complaints for years." Marcus arrived within the hour, still wearing his suit from the day's meetings. He stood behind his daughter, examining the evidence she'd uncovered. Spreadsheets showed escalating use of force incidents. Internal memos revealed dismissed warnings. Training records demonstrated a steady shift toward more aggressive tactics. "Look at these demographics," Sarah pointed to a chart. "Minority neighborhoods saw a 300% increase in special enforcement operations over the past 5 years. But complaints from these same neighborhoods were marked as unfounded at twice the rate of other areas." Marcus picked up a particular file, his expression darkening. "I know this case. 3 months ago, a veteran suffering from PTSD was roughed up during a routine stop. The department claimed he was combative. They buried the body cam footage," Sarah confirmed. "Just like they've buried dozens of other incidents. Crawford isn't an outlier. He's a symptom." Down in the records department, Lieutenant Martinez and her internal affairs team were making similar discoveries. Years of paperwork revealed a culture of protection and denial. Officers with multiple complaints were shuffled between precincts, rather than disciplined. Warning signs were ignored or actively suppressed. They created a perfect environment for bias to flourish, Martinez explained to Marcus when he joined them. New officers like Crawford didn't develop these attitudes in a vacuum. They were absorbed from the system itself. The evidence mounted hour by hour. Former officers began coming forward, sharing stories of being pushed out for reporting misconduct. Community leaders provided documented cases of profiling that had been dismissed. Even department veterans admitted to witnessing systematic problems they'd felt powerless to address. Marcus stood at the window of Sarah's office, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. His military training had taught him to look for patterns, to identify systemic weaknesses. What he saw in the department's history was more than just individual failures. It was institutional rot. "We're not just dealing with bad apples," he told Sarah. "The whole orchard needs replanting." His phone buzzed with a message from his SEAL team. Similar patterns were emerging in departments across the country. What had started as one incident in Atlanta was exposing a national crisis in law enforcement culture. The evidence they'd uncovered would shake the department to its foundations. But for Marcus, it confirmed what he'd suspected since the moment Crawford had pulled him over. This wasn't about one officer's mistake. It was about a system that had lost its way, and the long road back to what it should have been all along. The mayor's office had that distinct political feel, all polished wood and carefully chosen artwork that spoke of power without being too obvious about it. Marcus sat across from Mayor Richardson, a thick folder of evidence on the desk between them. The settlement offer lay open, a substantial sum, a public apology, and a promise of departmental review. $1 million, Master Chief Washington. The mayor leaned forward, his voice carrying practiced sincerity. Plus, guaranteed termination of Officer Crawford and implementation of new sensitivity training programs. A win for everyone. Marcus picked up the settlement paper, feeling its weight, both physical and symbolic. Behind him, Sarah stood silently, watching her father with knowing eyes. They discussed this moment, anticipated it, prepared for it. "Mr. Mayor," Marcus spoke with the quiet authority that had commanded elite teams in combat, "do you know why the Navy SEALs are so effective?" Richardson blinked at the unexpected question. "I assume it's the training." "It's because we never accept partial solutions to systemic problems." Marcus placed the settlement offer back on the desk, unsigned. "This document right here? This is a band-aid on a bullet wound. Master Chief, be reasonable." The mayor's tone shifted slightly. "This is a generous offer, more than generous, and the reforms are superficial." Marcus cut in. "We've uncovered evidence of systematic discrimination, buried complaints, and institutional protection of bad actors. Firing one officer and adding some training sessions won't fix that. Sarah stepped forward, placing another folder on the desk. This is our counter-proposal. Complete overhaul of recruitment and training, independent civilian oversight with real power, transparent complaint investigation procedures, and a complete audit of all use of force incidents from the past 5 years. The mayor's face tightened. That's impossible. The union would never— The union's already on board, Marcus interrupted again. My team's been busy. We've got support from police unions in 3 states. Turns out good officers are tired of being tarred with the same brush as the bad ones. Richardson leaned back, studying Marcus with new eyes. And if we refuse, then tomorrow every major news outlet gets copies of everything we've found. Every buried complaint, every covered-up incident, every piece of evidence showing systematic discrimination. Your administration's legacy becomes the department that had to be forced to change. The mayor stood, walking to his window. Below, protesters still gathered daily, their numbers now including police officers' families, demanding reform. This goes beyond just our department, doesn't it? It always did, Marcus replied. From the moment Officer Crawford pulled me over, this was about something bigger. The question is, do you want to be remembered as the administration that helped fix the system, or the one that tried to buy its way out of responsibility? Sarah watched her father with pride. This was the man who taught her about integrity, about fighting the right battles the right way, the man who turned his own humiliation into a weapon for change. Richardson turned back from the window. You never intended to take the settlement, did you? No, sir. Marcus stood, straightening his tie. Because some things are worth more than money. This is about making sure what happened to me doesn't happen to anyone else. It's about turning a moment of injustice into a movement for change. As they left the mayor's office, Sarah squeezed her father's hand. He'll cave, she said confidently. By tomorrow morning. Marcus nodded. Of course he will. Because we're not just fighting a legal battle. We're fighting for the soul of law enforcement itself, and that's a fight worth more than any settlement. The department's meditation room, normally used for officers dealing with post-incident stress, had been chosen for this meeting. Marcus sat in one of 2 chairs, arranged in the center of the space, his posture relaxed but alert. When Crawford entered, the young officer's usual swagger was gone, replaced by an uncertain tension. Sit down, son, Marcus gestured to the empty chair. The word son carried no condescension, only the weight of experience addressing youth. Crawford lowered himself into the chair, his uniform crisp, but his shoulders hunched. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Do you know what the hardest lesson I learned in combat was? Marcus finally broke the silence. It wasn't about weapons or tactics. It was about perception, about how quick assumptions can get people killed. Crawford's hands tightened on his. On knees. Sir, I'm not finished. Marcus's voice remained calm, but carried unmistakable authority. When you saw me in that car, you made assumptions, but I want you to understand something. I made assumptions too. I assumed you were just another angry young officer drunk on authority, and maybe we were both wrong. The words hung in the air. Crawford looked up, meeting Marcus's eyes for the first time. I've seen your record, Marcus continued. High marks at the academy, commendations for bravery. You're not stupid, Officer Crawford. So let's talk about what really happened that morning. Crawford swallowed hard. The past week had stripped away his defenses, forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. I saw what I expected to see, what I was trained to see. Trained by whom? Marcus leaned forward. The department, or something deeper, something you learned long before you put on that badge? The question hit Crawford like a physical blow. Images flashed through his mind, childhood dinners with his father ranting about those people, high school friends making casual jokes, academy instructors emphasizing profile indicators. I never thought of myself as— Crawford struggled with the words. As racist, Marcus finished for him. Few do. But bias isn't always about burning crosses or shouting slurs. Sometimes it's about split-second decisions, about who you choose to stop, about how quickly you reach for those handcuffs. Tears welled in Crawford's eyes, years of certainty crumbling under the weight of realization. How do you fix something that deep? The same way you learn any tactical skill, Marcus replied. Through recognition, repetition, and a willingness to change. The question is, are you willing to do the work? Crawford wiped his eyes, straightening in his chair. What happens now? That depends on you. Marcus stood, his movement drawing Crawford to his feet as well. I'm implementing new training programs, not just here, but across the country. I need officers willing to speak honestly about their experiences, their mistakes, their growth. It won't be easy. You'll face resistance from other officers, criticism from all sides. Why me? Crawford asked. After what I did, because change has to start somewhere. Marcus stepped closer. And sometimes the best teachers are the ones who've learned the hardest lessons. He extended his hand. Crawford stared at it for a long moment before reaching out to shake it. Both men felt the weight of the gesture. Not forgiveness exactly, but the beginning of something new. Report to my office Monday morning, Marcus said as he turned to leave. We've got a lot of work to do. Crawford watched him go, still feeling the phantom pressure of that handshake. In less than 15 minutes, Marcus Washington had done what a week of protests and investigations couldn't. He'd given Crawford a path forward, a way to turn his shame into purpose. The city council chambers were packed beyond capacity. Television cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like artificial stars. On one side sat the police department's leadership, their brass insignias catching the light. On the other, Marcus Washington and his team of reformers, including a visibly changed Officer Crawford. Council President Chen called the session to order, her gavel crack echoing through the tense chamber. Today, we consider proposed reforms to the Atlanta Police Department following the Washington incident. Master Chief Washington, you have the floor. Marcus approached the podium with military precision. The room fell silent, waiting for anger, for accusations. Instead, they got something unexpected: hope. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, we're not here to tear down the police department. We're here to rebuild it. Not as an occupying force, but as what it should have always been, a partner in community safety and justice. Behind him, PowerPoint slides began displaying statistics, incident reports, and proposed solutions. This wasn't just criticism. It was a complete roadmap for transformation. Our research has revealed systematic issues in training, oversight, and accountability, Marcus continued. But we've also found something else. Hundreds of officers who want change, who are tired of seeing their profession tarnished by bias and misconduct. The chamber stirred as Crawford stood up, walking to the podium. His testimony had been carefully prepared, but when he spoke, it came from the heart. A week ago, I thought I was a good cop, he began, his voice shaking slightly. I had the highest arrest numbers in my precinct. I thought that meant I was doing my job right. Master Chief Washington showed me what those numbers really meant, that I was part of a system that confused control with protection, force with authority. The camera's word, capturing every word. In the audience, other officers nodded, recognition dawning in their eyes. Sarah Washington presented the legal framework next, laying out new oversight procedures and accountability measures. This isn't about punishing police, she explained. It's about creating a system where good officers can thrive and bad behavior can't hide. The police union representative, traditionally an opponent of reform, stood up. We've reviewed these proposals extensively, he announced. While challenging, they represent the kind of change our members have been asking for. We're tired of being viewed as the enemy. We want to be part of the solution. As the hearing progressed, Marcus's military expertise became evident in every detail of the proposed reforms. training programs borrowed from SEAL team protocols on threat assessment and de-escalation. Oversight systems reflected military accountability structures. Even the proposed community engagement initiatives drew from counterinsurgency lessons about winning public trust. Captain Myers took the podium last, his earlier resistance replaced by conviction. "A week ago, I would have fought these changes," he admitted. "But Master Chief Washington didn't just show us what we were doing wrong. He showed us how to do it right. These reforms aren't just necessary, they're achievable." The council chambers erupted in discussion as the final proposals were presented. Body camera reforms, new training protocols, independent oversight committees, community involvement in officer evaluation, each element carefully designed to transform not just policies, but culture. Marcus watched from his seat as the council members debated. His expression remained neutral, but Sarah could see the satisfaction in his eyes. This wasn't just about changing one department, it was about creating a model that could be replicated across the country. The vote, when it came, was unanimous. As the gavel fell, Marcus stood, straightening his tie. The real work was just beginning, but the first battle, perhaps the most important one, had been won. 6 months after the Washington incident, the Atlanta Police Department's training facility had transformed beyond recognition. The old shooting range still stood, but beside it now was a state-of-the-art simulation center where officers practiced de-escalation scenarios. In one room, Marcus Washington stood watching a group of recruits work through a complex community interaction exercise. "Your first instinct was to reach for your weapon," he told a young officer whose hand had drifted to her holster during the simulation. "But what did you miss while focusing on a potential threat?" The recruit reviewed the scenario footage. "The subject was protecting someone behind him," she realized. "I didn't even notice the child." "Situational awareness isn't just about identifying threats," Marcus explained. "It's about understanding the complete picture. In my SEAL days, missing details got people killed. In police work, it gets communities destroyed." Down the hall, Crawford had become an unexpected asset in the department's transformation. His personal journey from problem officer to reform advocate carried weight with resistant colleagues. Today, he was leading a session on recognizing implicit bias, using his own story as a teaching tool. "I used to judge success by the number of arrests I made," he told the assembled officers. "Now I measure it by the number of situations I can resolve without reaching for handcuffs." The changes weren't limited to training. Community oversight panels now reviewed body camera footage regularly. Civilian observers participated in officer evaluations. The department's demographic makeup was slowly shifting to better reflect the community it served. Sarah Washington's legal team had set up office space within the police headquarters, creating direct channels for addressing complaints and concerns. The sight of civilians freely moving through the building had been jarring at first, but it was now becoming normal. "Remember," Marcus told a group of veteran officers during an advanced training session, "authority doesn't come from your badge or your weapon. It comes from the community's trust. And trust has to be earned every single day." The statistics were beginning to show results. Use of force incidents had dropped by 40%, civilian complaints were down, while successful conflict resolutions were up. More significantly, officer job satisfaction had improved as the antagonistic relationship with the community began to heal. Other departments had taken notice. Police chiefs from across the country visited to observe the Washington model in action. Marcus's former SEAL teammates helped establish similar programs in their own cities, creating a network of reform-minded departments. One afternoon, Marcus found Crawford sitting alone in the break room, staring at his reflection in the window. "Having doubts?" he asked, taking a seat across from the younger man. "No, sir," Crawford replied, "just thinking about how different things could have been. That morning I pulled you over. I was so sure I was right." "Being wrong isn't the problem," Marcus said. Refusing to learn from it is. You've helped more officers by admitting your mistakes than you ever would have by trying to justify them. The department's transformation hadn't been smooth. Some officers had resigned rather than adapt. Others had fought the changes at every step. But the core group that remained was stronger, more professional, more connected to their community. In the training center's main hall, a new motto had been painted on the wall: "Protect with respect, serve with honor." Below it hung a photo of Marcus Washington in his SEAL uniform, next to one of him shaking hands with Crawford at the public hearing. It served as a daily reminder that change was possible, that mistakes could lead to growth, that even the worst moments could become catalysts for transformation. Outside, in the communities they served, the changes were evident. Officers walked their beats with new awareness, engaged with residents differently, approached situations with better understanding. The US versus them mentality was slowly being replaced by a sense of shared purpose. The hardest part of change, Marcus often told new recruits, is believing it's possible. But once you see it working, once you experience the difference it makes, you can't imagine doing the job any other way. As the sun set over Atlanta, Marcus watched another class of officers graduate from the new training program. In their faces, he saw the future of law enforcement, not just in one city, but across the nation. The incident that could have ended in tragedy had instead sparked a revolution in police culture, proving that sometimes the best victory isn't winning the fight, but transforming it into something better. 1 year to the day after the Washington incident, Marcus stood at his bedroom window, adjusting his tie in the early morning light. His restored Mustang sat in the driveway, gleaming as always. But this Sunday, he wasn't heading to church. He was driving to the police academy's graduation ceremony, where he would give the keynote address. As he drove through his neighborhood, he noticed the changes that had taken root. Police officers walked their beats in pairs, engaging with residents on porches and in front yards. Children played freely, no longer tensing up at the sight of a patrol car. The atmosphere had shifted from surveillance to partnership. At the academy, Crawford waited outside, now wearing the stripes of a training supervisor. "Good morning, Master Chief," he said, standing straight, but with a genuine smile. "Ready to inspire another class?" The graduation ceremony was being broadcast nationally. Departments across the country had adopted the Washington model, and the results were speaking for themselves. Crime rates hadn't just dropped. Community trust had soared. The US versus them mentality was being replaced by a spirit of mutual respect and shared responsibility. Marcus took his place at the podium, looking out over the faces of the graduating class. Diverse, determined, and trained in a new way of thinking about law enforcement. In the audience, he spotted Sarah, who had gone on to establish a national police reform consultancy. Beside her sat Captain Myers, now Chief Myers, who had become one of the most vocal advocates for nationwide reform. 1 year ago, Marcus began. A traffic stop could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it became a catalyst for transformation. You are the first class to complete your entire training under the new protocols. You represent not just the future of law enforcement, but the realization that true authority comes from respect, not fear. As he concluded his speech, Marcus watched the new officers receive their badges. Each one had been through intensive training in de-escalation, implicit bias recognition, and community engagement. They had learned from both his successes and Crawford's mistakes. They understood that the uniform they wore was a symbol of public trust, not public power. After the ceremony, Marcus drove home, taking the same route where everything had started. He passed the spot where Crawford had pulled him over, now marked with a small plaque commemorating the beginning of the reform movement. The inscription, "Dread, where challenge became change." Parking his Mustang in the driveway, Marcus smiled at Mr. Chen next door, who was still tending his roses. The neighborhood had changed, but its heart remained the same. people living together, looking out for each other, building a community where everyone felt safe and respected. Inside, he hung up his jacket and looked at the photo wall he'd created. Images tracking the year's progress. Crawford's transformation, the public hearing, the first graduation under the new program. Each picture told part of a story that had grown beyond one incident to become a movement. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. "Dad, they're adopting the program in 3 more states next month. Your traffic stop is going to change policing across the entire country." Marcus sat in his favorite chair, reflecting on how a moment of potential tragedy had become a legacy of transformation. The change hadn't been easy, and there was still work to be done. But as he watched the sun set over Atlanta, he knew that sometimes the greatest victories come not from winning battles, but from changing the way the war is fought. The Washington incident would be studied in police academies for years to come, not as a story of conflict, but as a lesson in how challenge could become opportunity, how bias could be transformed into understanding, and how one moment of injustice could spark a revolution of respect.